Our session for today is dietary demand and competition for land. Harn, can you see the screen right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we're going to have a science and policy discussion breakout group. So as many of you may be aware, the emissions per 100 grams of protein is largely skewed in the direction of animal-based products, and many plant-based products tend to have about an order of magnitude less impacts. This pertains to dietary demand because if we look at dietary demand in developed countries, particularly here in the EU, that have both high agricultural efficiency and a high amount of meat and dairy consumption, the vast majority of production emissions are in the animal sourced food categories, with only about the remaining 15% being in all plant food categories. And this is particularly noticeable because even Europeans don't get a majority of their protein from animal sources. It's about half and half in most developed countries. And as we break that down, we see a lot of it has to do with land use change, predominantly from animal agriculture. Transportation emissions are smaller than most folks tend to know or kind of intuitively recognize. And a lot of the others are from fertilizer, manure management, and methane emissions. So that's when we look at the emission sources, we can see that a lot of them, of course, are from animal-based sources, which is why there has been so much conversation about opportunities for reducing emissions by changing dietary demand towards predominantly plant-based diets. Studies have estimated that in developed countries, this would have an emissions reduction of around anywhere between 33 to 70% of the average dietary footprint being reduced. And now onto the competition for land part. About half of the world's habitable land is occupied by agriculture, seen here in this first bar chart, and the majority of which is for meat and dairy. And when we zoom out to a global extent, we can see that about a third of the global protein supply and less than a fifth of the global calorie supply comes from animal-based products, despite those products representing the majority of land use. So the way that dietary demand links up with competition for land is that most of these habitable production areas for animal source have so-called carbon opportunity costs, which colleagues of mine and I recently just published in the journal Nature Sustainability. These are all of the animal agriculture production areas currently on Earth, less the additional arable land that would be needed to replace those products. And you can see there are a wide range of carbon opportunity costs of potentially reforesting or restoring that land, leading to carbon sequestration in the process, with the lighter green areas resulting in very little carbon sequestration, like in the Eastern Central Asian grasslands, and the largest by far opportunities being in tropical forests, as well as temperate forests, temperate humid forests in the Eastern United States and in Western Europe. So with that, I don't want to take up too much more time. Really want to get around to just kicking off a general discussion, and I'll go ahead and leave these up. What are key data modeling gaps and how can they be filled? How are policies lagging behind scientific knowledge? And what are innovative ways of addressing knowledge gaps that can inform policy and include stakeholders? So really with that, I feel like I've been talking a lot already. Does anyone have any contributions to make here?
Yeah, so just maybe starting with the first one. This is Elke from the image team, and we have done some work already on dietary shifts and the effects on greenhouse gases. So on the one hand side, I would say that we already know a lot, and maybe as in some other parts of climate policy, we probably know enough for taking the necessary steps. And especially with the Lancet diet suggestions and the estimation of effects, we already know a lot. And if there's still some data gaps, I would see the grassland issue. and the land use related with the dietary changes. I mean, the Lancet and the Springman paper concentrated on just greenhouse gases, not the land use effect. And so, I mean, there's big estimates for the land use effect, so the CO2 that can be sequestered. And there is still, I think, something to win getting more information on the uncertainty around the carbon effects of grassland forest conversions, for example. So because these are the big areas, and studies differ in whether and how they take into account soil carbon, for example.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's maybe on the data gaps, and maybe others can contribute before moving further.
Yeah, happy to take, thank you for that, Elke, and appreciate your contribution to the group today. I do want to clarify that in the study that I just showed, we don't assume any kind of afforestation of grasslands to forests. It's just kind of deficits between current grazing managed practices and some type of equilibrium or potential vegetation state of those same grasslands.
Yeah.
And the rest is very well taken. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, it's more in general and not just your study. Yeah, I mean, there's
Does anyone else have any thoughts? Particularly, I mean, feel free to contribute about, you know, knowledge gaps in the science, but really, like, how does the rubber start meeting the road here? How do we actually get people to start thinking about policies that would result in actual dietary change? Or if not people changing drastically towards shifting drastically towards plant-based food consumption, perhaps bending the upward trajectory of increased meat and dairy consumption that's happening rapidly in developing economy and emerging economies.
Hi, Matthew, it's Carolyn, and I'm here actually to support you, but I can't help but comment.
Please do.
In some of the areas that we're discussing, actually, the upward increase in protein sources is extremely important, and we need to actually sort of, you know, take consideration of the fact that there are different dietary needs than just average ones. And so one thing I'm wondering is, you know, as with all things, the devil is in the details. And so how do you actually take sort of a global analysis like the kind that you're doing, which is very informative for sort of international sort of scales of policy, but then it, you know, it really, it also touches on what is acceptable in other scales and you know, customs. I wonder if you have any comments about just, you know, in the context of the questions that we're trying to answer, can you just say a little bit about the scale issues?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So first of all, in this paper, we wanted to begin to, and I do want to expand it larger than just the paper, but there's a recent publication that just came out that I think helps inform the directions that you're talking about how scalable this is or applicable across very diverse, you know, agricultural and economic development landscapes. So in our paper, we did partition this between high, upper middle, lower middle, and low income countries. And we actually found that the predominant effect was in upper middle income countries, and that the high income country effect was as large as the lower middle income country effect. So a bit on that. Regarding the need for some countries to increase their protein intake, the WWF just released a report on shifts to plant-rich diets off the heels of the Eat Lancet report that about 147 countries are within that country above their per capita consumption of red meat. So that means that all of the other remaining countries, the 80 odd additional countries, need improvements in sustainably developing their protein sources, their livestock sector. And for the other 147 countries that were mentioned that are above consumption, shifts towards plant-based, predominantly plant-based sources is what was recommended. And that's consistent with these Eat Lancet type, for those of you who don't know, these were dietary recommendations that looked at discrepancies between what a healthy and sustainable diet broadly consists of and what average production and consumption is in pretty much all countries on Earth. So I like that partitioning where it's like 147 versus 80 odd countries, because it gives you a rough sense of what levels of consumption and production countries could think about in an ideal system kind of equilibrating to.
So, and so maybe some more contribution. So, I mean, you can see the Lancet diet as a vision for the consumer, huh? So where the consumer diet could go to. I think what's really lacking is a vision for the farmers, and that's essentially why there's so much. I mean, they are fighting the trend towards less meat in Europe and probably everywhere, because that's how they earn their money. And so this is really the biggest challenge, I think. And there is, for various reasons, of course, there is no work for working out the vision for the farming system, right? And so maybe that's a knowledge gap, a scenario gap, that is, if you would do such scenarios, visioning Europe with what actually do the farmers do in such scenarios, that could help the transition.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would agree that the Eat Lancet diets are a vision for consumption. The trick with that is that, kind of in an economics perspective, changes in consumption beget changes in production. But the issue with that, as you mentioned, is it can cause a lot of farmers to get angry and a lot of people to go out of business. Or in the case of small market, smallholders, market smallholders, it could cause them to, their livelihood to evaporate if they can't shift. So I think if we were to lead with changes in consumption, we would need to think about these shifts in a way that don't cause farmers to kind of go out of business and all of the production to be kind of consolidated in the hands of a few corporations, which is increasingly being referred to as just transitions for, or just livelihoods for producers. And this is a direction that our food system emissions group wants to move in towards, but it's a much larger equation. It's a much larger endeavor than I think even a dozen people can necessarily answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not just a science question for this specific group, but it's in more general terms, yes, and it's complicated, but at least some work should start, I think, there. And what we also see with our economic analysis, by the way, if we assume that just the consumers shift towards more plant-based diets, and there is no other demand for land increasing from afforestation or bioenergy, so then land prices fall. You get all kinds of leakages. You get extensification. So just doing it from the consumer side will also not work in that sense.
So this is Carolyn again, and I just want to interject. I mean, you mentioned the word corporations, and of course, corporations are huge in the marketing of especially the packaged food that is encouraged to be purchased, even though it may not be of high nutrient quality. It's seen to be, sort of a proxy for wealth in some cases, right? And so there's a thinking there that if we actually want to address it, we actually have to involve the private sector. So I'm wondering, to what extent is this project intending to engage the private sector on some of the issues relating to consumer preferences?
We don't have any plans as of yet to engage. I would say we have plans to engage stakeholders more broadly very soon, but not necessarily plans to single out stakeholders in the private sector about those consumer demand issues.
And let me just respond. I don't mean single out. I mean partner with them, because they are the sources of the key data from which we could understand modeling, because they do a huge amount of modeling on the trajectories of advertising success and things of this nature. And they have a huge amount of data on the purchasing trends in many of the places that fit in this low, middle, and upper middle areas. So how can we work with them to establish good outcomes while also improving the dietary options, perhaps, that are advocated for? I think that we can't, there's sort of the elephant in the room, right? There's a lot of, the diet choices are not just the food that's available. There's a lot of other factors that come into the human dimension of how they make choices, right?
Yeah, so leveraging the private sector for behavioral insights as well as economic insight. I
think the economic insight would lead to understanding of the prior. I don't know the extent to which they would be willing to share data, but I think it's an important partnership to pursue, because it's a direction that we sort of all need to go together. Yeah. And I don't see sufficient engagement of the private sector in the studies that I'm familiar with, but I have to admit I'm not familiar with many of them. So I will quiet and rely on the rest of the group to uptake at this point.
I'm noticing Chandan has their hand up.
Hi, Matthew. This is Chandan here. So basically, I work on Fable Pathways project led by SDSN. So I'm currently working on sustainable food and land use systems. So I have a question regarding this EAT Lancet. Like, through my analysis, we have observed that the EAT Lancet has a large potential to decrease GHG emission in India because livestock sector is having the largest emission source. But in terms of the policies, like we observe, we have seen through the several literature, like the affordability is a major issue for the plant-based or, the plant-based protein system, like in terms of the EAT Lancet. So, how to tackle that kind of situation where in the developing countries or the low-income countries, so affordability is a major barriers for implementing this kind of things. Another question, like maybe to the first point, like I also compare the different shared socioeconomic pathways food demand system, and let's say in terms of the SSP2, which is quite at the moderate level, but the livestock demand is quite high. Mm-hmm. So what I'm finding in terms of the data, like the entire livestock production system data is not quite necessarily representative. Let's say the feed basket and the feed basket data set from the FAO and all these sources, like it's giving us a very different story, and due to that, the modeling is not giving. I'm using MACPI model developed by Peak, so I'm finding that there's some issue, like it's giving a completely different results, because the feed use for the major crops are quite high. It's not correct in terms of the India, but yes, this international data sets are giving that kind of figures. So I'm struggling with how to solve this kind of problems. Like, yeah, we more have to implement the national level data sets, national representative data sets in the global modeling system.
So first point first, the affordability as a barrier to healthier and more sustainable diets, I think, is a really important one. And I kind of want to go into the group before kind of addressing the feed basket and feed conversion ratios, second issue that you brought up. Affordability is a barrier in many places for people eating anything other than, you know, meat and potatoes, or, you know, chicken and cassava, or rice and, you know, pork. But is what is the same as what should be in terms of which foods are more affordable and which foods are less affordable. Particularly the subsidies of feed grains that are fed to animals to convert them into meat and dairy are quite high in a lot of countries. And I'm curious to the extent to which having a conversation about this problem of affordability actually opens up a conversation about solutions to the problem, which is changing subsidies, incentives, and penalties of taxes.
Yeah, I mean, that's also a good way to, I mean, fill these policy gaps in terms of the affordability.
So far we've identified affordability knowledge gaps in terms of translating the science into policy. We've identified some affordability knowledge gaps, gaps around how to change, I wouldn't say farmer behavior, but buy-in from producer groups, as well as gaps of consumer behavior and how the private sector could be leveraged for for demand side transformation. Can anyone think of any large gaps or solutions to such gaps in the remaining, I guess, 3 minutes that we have here? Is there anything else that folks want to bring up?
Well, it's Carolyn again, and I hate to take the airwaves when we have such other experienced and distinguished people on the line, but you know, I'm from California, and there a lot of the small to medium-sized farmers have turned to direct contracts with the grocery units that they provide, and so they work together to make sure that the crops are tuned to the products that the consumers in that area want. And that to me seems a step in the right direction, that you have like a partnership that's starting to emerge between the farmers and the point of sale where consumers receive food. It's probably quite variable depending on what country you're in, but it's responsive to the consumer demand, and seems to also result in quite a bit of horticultural products in addition to the staples.
Yeah, I think it varies country by country, and even as you mentioned, state by state. It's I'm very envious of West Coast produce, especially coming up to this time of year. Yeah, with that, I think unless anyone has some concluding comments, we can kind of break apart and enter the main Zoom again. So thank you everybody for coming to the session, especially those who have contributed and those who are listening in. And yes, we'll meet back there and kind of present our discussion points to the rest of the larger group. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thanks. Bye.